There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a Tuesday night that feels like any other Tuesday night, until it doesn't. They are the hairline fractures in the bedrock of your routine, the subtle shift in the atmosphere before a storm. You don't recognize them as fault lines until much later, when you look back and see the chasm that opened up from that single, quiet point of pressure. For me, that moment smelled of old books and Earl Grey tea, and it had the specific, impossible weight of Leo's head resting on my shoulder. The television was murmuring some forgotten documentary about deep-sea life, casting flickering blue light across the room, turning the familiar landscape of my living room into an alien ocean floor. And in that silent, blue-lit world, I was holding my breath, terrified that the slightest exhale would shatter the fragile ecosystem we had somehow created. He was asleep, or pretending to be, and I was monumentally, painfully awake, cataloging the reality of it. The warmth seeping through my sweatshirt, the soft, rhythmic puff of his breath against my neck, the stray strand of his blonde hair catching the light like a filament of spun gold. This was the precipice. I knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was thrilling, that once he woke up, or once I moved, the world we had lived in before this moment would be gone forever. We were standing on opposite sides of a door, and he had just placed his hand on the knob. I had no idea if he meant to open it, or to lock it for good. We had met in the way so many people do, through the indifferent lottery of university housing. I was assigned to a double room with Leo Maxwell, a name that already seemed to carry a certain weight on campus before he'd even swum his first competitive lap for the university team. I was a ghost by comparison, a photography student who spent more time with the silver halides in the campus darkroom than with actual human beings. Our room was a study in contrast from the very first day. My side was a landscape of muted grays and blacks, stacks of photography books with austere covers, a single, perfectly tended succulent on the windowsill, and my camera gear laid out with surgical precision. His side was a controlled explosion of primary colors. University banners, swim team paraphernalia, a chaotic pile of textbooks he seemed to absorb through osmosis, and a rotating gallery of photos featuring a constellation of smiling friends and a very pretty, very serious girlfriend named Chloe. He was sunlight and noise. I was shadow and quiet. It should not have worked. By all accounts, we should have coexisted in a state of polite, resentful silence for a year before gratefully parting ways. But Leo was not built for polite silence. He was a creature of connection, radiating a kind of effortless warmth that drew people in. He treated our shared space not as a divided territory, but as a home base, a place of shared existence. He'd burst in after a grueling practice, smelling of chlorine and victory, and toss a granola bar onto my desk. "You haven't eaten, have you, Alex?" he'd say, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact, a problem to be solved. He'd drag me out to the dining hall, talking animatedly about lap times and the biomechanics of a perfect flip turn, and I would listen, fascinated by this person who lived so completely and uncomplicatedly in his own skin. He never seemed to question his place in the world. He belonged. I, on the other hand, felt like a visiting anthropologist, carefully documenting a foreign culture I could never truly join. It was during one of those early months that the foundation of our strange friendship was truly laid. A group of his teammates, loud and boisterous and fueled by cheap beer, had cornered me in the common room, their teasing straddling the line between playful and cruel. They were riffing on my quietness, my black clothes, my general air of artistic seriousness. I was doing what I always did, making myself smaller, deflecting with noncommittal murmurs, waiting for the storm to pass. And then Leo was there. He didn't say much. He just walked into the center of the group, put a heavy, comfortable arm around my shoulders, and said, "Leave him alone. He's thinking," the way he said it, with such casual, unshakable authority, instantly deflated the situation. The jock shrugged, laughed it off, and moved on. Leo's arm stayed there for a moment longer than necessary, a silent anchor. He didn't look at me or ask if I was okay. He just gave my shoulder a firm squeeze and went to the fridge to grab a water. The gesture was clear. I am on your side. You are with me. In that moment, something inside me that had been clenched tight for years began to, ever so slightly, unwind. That was how it started. He became my protector, my social shield. He seemed to have an innate understanding of my boundaries, knowing exactly how much social interaction I could handle before needing to retreat. He'd include me without demanding participation. I became a fixture in his orbit, the quiet satellite to his blazing sun. I would go to his swim meets, finding a spot high in the stands where I could be anonymous. I'd watch him slice through the water, a study in fluid power and grace. I started taking pictures of him, not just for the student paper, but for myself. It began as an exercise in capturing motion, the spray of water frozen in a crystalline explosion, the tension in the muscles of his back as he launched from the block. But it became something else. Through my lens, I could study him without the awkwardness of direct observation. I could see the flicker of exhaustion in his eyes after a race, the subtle set of his jaw when he was concentrating, the unguarded joy in his smile when he looked up at the scoreboard and saw the time he wanted. I was documenting the cartography of his face, the geography of his moods, and I was falling in love with the landscape. It was a quiet, hopeless, and deeply private kind of love, a photograph developing slowly in the sealed darkness of my own heart. I knew its proper place was in that darkness. To bring it into the light would be to overexpose it, to burn it to nothing. His friendship was a tangible, life-altering thing. It was a shelter. I would never risk that shelter for the impossible hope of something more. So I packed the feelings away, stored them in a light-proof box, and contented myself with being the keeper of his image, the quiet observer of his brilliant life. For 3 years, this was our equilibrium. We moved out of the dorms and into a small, 2-bedroom apartment off campus. He had Chloe, and I had my camera. It was a stable, predictable orbit. He was the anchor of my social world, and I was, I think, the anchor of his quiet one. I was the person he came to when he needed a break from the noise of his own life, from the demands of his team, and the complex emotional weather systems of his relationship with Chloe. We could sit in comfortable silence for hours, him studying, me editing photos, the only sounds the click of my mouse and the rustle of his pages. It was a peace I had never known with another person. He called me his human charger. He'd come home, drained and frayed, and just sit on the couch in my presence, and I could almost feel the energy returning to him. I never understood what I was giving him, but I was grateful to be able to give it. I was his harbor, and I was content with that role, because it meant he would always sail back to me. I told myself it was enough. For a long time it was. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, grinding tectonic movement that destabilized everything. It started with a phone call. I was in the darkroom, the soft red light painting the world in monochrome, my hands submerged in the cool, chemical-smelling bath of the developer. I was watching an image of a winter landscape emerge on the paper, a ghost becoming a memory, when my phone, left on the dry counter, began to vibrate insistently. It was Leo. His calls were usually short, energetic bursts of information. This was different. The vibration went on and on, a frantic, desperate buzzing in the quiet red dark. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I quickly rinsed my hands, fumbled for the phone, and answered. Alex. His voice was wrecked. It was a raw, hollowed-out sound I had never heard from him before. Leo's voice was always so full of life, of easy confidence. This was the voice of someone standing on a cliff edge in the dark. Leo? What's wrong? Where are you? She's gone. He whispered, and the words seemed to crack apart as he said them. She left. She packed her things, and she's gone, Chloe. It was over. Their 5-year relationship, the one that had seemed as solid and permanent as a mountain range, had crumbled into dust. He told me the story in disjointed fragments, punctuated by long, ragged breaths. She had felt they were growing in different directions. She saw a future he didn't see. It was calm, she'd said, civilized. But for Leo, it was an amputation. He had built his entire future around her, a detailed architectural blueprint of a life, and she had just walked off the job site, taking the plans with her. He was standing in the middle of a vacant lot with no idea what to build or how. I left the darkroom, leaving my print to drown in the developer bath, and went to find him. He was just sitting in his car in our designated parking spot, staring at the concrete wall. The engine was off. The sun was setting, and the light inside the car was dim and gray. I got in the passenger seat and just sat with him. I didn't say a word. There were no words. After a long time, he finally turned his head and looked at me, and his eyes were the eyes of a lost child. I had spent years looking at him, studying his every expression, but I had never seen this. I had never seen him so completely undone. That night was the beginning of the ritual. He couldn't be alone. The apartment we shared was suddenly haunted by the ghost of the future he had lost. His own room, with its lingering scent of her perfume and the empty space on the dresser where her picture used to be, was a torture chamber. So he started camping out in the living room. At first, he'd just fall asleep on the couch, the TV on, a textbook open on his chest. I'd find him there in the morning, his long frame contorted into the limited space, a blanket I'd thrown over him kicked to the floor. I started leaving the blanket and a pillow out for him before I went to bed, a small, unspoken act of care. It was my way of saying, I'm here. You are not alone. The couch was old and lumpy, a relic from a thrift store that was never intended for sleeping. After a week of it, he started complaining of a sore back, his movements stiff and pained in the mornings. He was exhausted, swimming badly, his grades slipping. He was adrift on a vast, lonely ocean, and the couch was a poor excuse for a life raft. One night, I found him standing in the hallway between our two bedrooms, a silhouette against the dim light from the living room. He was just standing there, looking at my closed door, then at his. He looked like a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. I can't sleep, he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. Every time I close my eyes, I can't. My heart ached for him. It was a pure, uncomplicated ache, the kind you feel for a friend in pain. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to give him a safe place to rest. My bed's bigger than the couch, I said, the words leaving my mouth before I had fully considered their weight. It was a simple, practical offer, a statement of fact. My room had a queen bed, his was a double, but the moment the words were out in the air between us, they took on a different shape. They became a threshold. He looked at me, and in the dim light, I couldn't read his expression. There was a long, humming silence. I thought he would refuse, laugh it off as a weird offer. My own mind was racing, already backpedaling, preparing a retraction. I just meant, you need the sleep, it's no big deal. But he just nodded slowly. Okay, he breathed. Yeah, okay. And so the ritual truly began. That first night was an agony of hyper-awareness. I gave him the side of the bed by the wall, trying to create as much physical distance as possible between us. I lay on the very edge of my side, my muscles rigid, my breathing shallow. The space was charged with a strange energy, a mix of his profound grief and my profound, terrified hope. He was a furnace of warmth next to me, a solid, living presence in the dark. I could hear every breath he took, feel the slight dip in the mattress with every small movement he made. He fell asleep almost instantly, the kind of deep, exhaustive sleep of someone who had been running on empty for days. I remained awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind a frantic riot. This was dangerous territory. I was a cartographer stepping into an uncharted land with no compass. The rules of our friendship were written for a different geography. Here, in the dark, in this shared space, they felt flimsy and inadequate. It became a nightly occurrence. He would finish studying, or just staring blankly at the television, and he would simply walk into my room and get into the bed. There was no more asking, no more discussion. It was the new normal. He would murmur a night, Alex, his voice thick with sleep, and turn away from me, and I would lie there, a silent custodian of his rest. My bedroom, once my sanctuary, my fortress of solitude, had become a shared space. The door, which I had always closed with a definitive click, was now left slightly ajar, a silent signal that the way was open. The open door became a symbol of this new, fragile, and deeply ambiguous chapter of our lives. It was neither open nor closed, a state of permanent transition. It was an invitation without words, a question without a question mark. Weeks turned into a month, then two. The raw, sharp edges of his grief began to soften, but the loneliness remained, a low-grade fever that never broke. And the ritual in my room began to evolve. The careful distance we maintained in the bed started to shrink. It began with a foot brushing against mine in the night, a moment of accidental contact that sent a jolt through my entire system. Then, one night, I woke up to find his arm thrown across my chest, his hand resting limply near my shoulder. He was fast asleep, his face turned towards me, his breath warm on my cheek. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure it would wake him. I lay there, pinned by the gentle weight of his arm, not daring to move, not wanting to move. It felt like a benediction. I felt like a man dying of thirst who had stumbled upon an oasis, terrified that it was only a mirage. I carefully, slowly, lifted my own hand and let my fingers hover just above his. I wanted, more than anything, to touch him, to close that final millimeter of space, to feel the warmth of his skin under my own. But I didn't. The risk was too great. To misinterpret this, to mistake an unconscious act of comfort for something more, would be to detonate the fragile peace we had built. So I just lay there, a statue of longing, until the sun began to filter through the blinds and I heard his breathing change as he started to wake. I closed my eyes and feigned sleep, and felt the weight lift as he carefully removed his arm. Neither of us ever mentioned it. The unspoken nature of it all was the hardest part. During the day, we were the same as we'd always been. We were Alex and Leo, roommates, best friends. We'd talk about classes, about his training, about the mundane details of our lives. But there was a new current running beneath the surface of our conversations, a low hum of awareness that had never been there before. I was constantly scanning for signals, analyzing every word, every gesture, for a hidden meaning. When he'd lean in to show me something on his laptop and his shoulder would press against mine, was it casual or was it a test? When he'd hold my gaze for a second too long across the dinner table, was it my imagination or was there a question in his eyes? I was living a double life, the calm, supportive friend on the outside, and a frantic, obsessive codebreaker on the inside. My own feelings, which I had kept so neatly packed away, had broken free of their container. They were no longer a quiet, manageable ache, but a living, breathing thing that took up all the space in my chest. I started to see our lives through the frame of my camera lens, even when I wasn't holding it. I saw the composition of us on the couch, the careful space between our bodies a form of negative space, defining the shape of what was unsaid. I saw the way the morning light would hit the pillow where his head had been, a temporary indentation that felt both sacred and painful. I was capturing these moments in my mind, a secret collection of images. A photograph is a slice of time, a moment preserved, and that's what I was doing. I was preserving the evidence of his proximity, the proof that this impossible intimacy was real, even if I couldn't understand it. I was terrified it would all vanish, that one morning he would wake up and the spell would be broken, and he would retreat back to his own room, closing the door on this strange interlude and leaving me alone with the ghost of his warmth. The nature of the comfort he sought began to change, becoming more deliberate, less accidental. He started initiating the closeness. He would be sitting on the couch, watching a movie, and he would shift, patting the cushion next to him. "Come on, it's the good part," he'd say, and when I sat, he would lean his head against my shoulder, as naturally as if he had been doing it his whole life. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid. I was so afraid of doing the wrong thing, of tensing up and signaling rejection, or relaxing too much and signaling an intimacy I wasn't sure he was offering. So I just sat there, a pillar of feigned nonchalance, while my heart staged a full-scale rebellion inside my chest. His hair smelled faintly of the cheap shampoo we shared, a clean, familiar scent that suddenly felt overwhelmingly intimate. This became a new part of the ritual. Movie nights were no longer just movie nights. They were an excuse for a specific, sanctioned form of touch. And in the bed, The accidental brushes became intentional. He would turn over in the middle of the night and press his back against mine, a long line of solid, reassuring warmth. Sometimes, he'd reach back in his sleep and his hand would find mine, his fingers loosely intertwining with my own. These were the moments that undid me. Holding his hand in the dark, his breathing deep, and even beside me, felt more intimate than any kiss I could imagine. It felt like a quiet confession. But in the morning, it was always gone. The connection would be broken, and we would be two separate people again, carefully navigating the space around each other. The ambiguity was a form of torture. It was a beautiful, exquisite torture, but it was chipping away at my sanity. I was living on a knife's edge of hope and fear, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep my balance. The breaking point, the moment the unspoken tension finally became unbearable, arrived on a cold night in late November. A storm was raging outside, the wind howling and rattling the window frames of our small apartment. It was the kind of night that forces you inward, that makes the world outside feel distant and hostile. We were in my room, not yet in bed, just sitting on the floor, leaning against the frame, listening to the rain lash against the glass. We weren't talking. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said for the past 3 months. I could feel it, a physical pressure against my skin. Leo had been quiet all evening, a deeper quiet than his usual post-breakup melancholy. It was a restless, troubled silence. He kept running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I recognized as a sign of deep anxiety. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but I was afraid of the answer. I was afraid that he was finally going to say the words I dreaded, that this had been a mistake, that he needed his space, that he was ready to go back to his own room. He was creating a new life for himself, slowly. He was going out more with his friends. He was talking about his plans for after graduation. I could feel him pulling away, rebuilding the walls that his grief had dissolved, and I was terrified of being left on the outside. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice was low, barely audible above the storm. "Alex." "Yeah." My own voice was tight. I braced myself. He turned his head to look at me. In the shadowy light, his eyes were dark pools of uncertainty. His gaze was so direct, so intense, it felt like a physical touch. The casual, brotherly affection that had always been there was gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable and terrifyingly new. "Is this?" he started, then stopped. He swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Is this okay?" It was a simple question, but it contained a universe of meaning. He wasn't just asking about tonight, about sitting on the floor in the dark. He was asking about all of it. The couch, the bed, the open door, the hands held in the dark, the heads resting on shoulders. He was holding up the fragile, unclassifiable thing we had built between us and asking me to name it, to validate it. He was giving me the power to define it, or to end it. My entire life, I had been an observer. I lived behind a lens, capturing the world without ever truly participating in it. I protected myself with distance, with silence. My feelings for Leo were the most vital, vibrant thing in my life, and I had kept them in a cage of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of ridicule, but most of all, fear of ruining the one friendship that had ever made me feel seen, that had ever made me feel safe. And in that moment, looking at his face, at the genuine, desperate question in his eyes, I realized that the greatest risk was not in speaking, but in remaining silent. To let this moment pass, to deflect with a vague reassurance, would be to suffocate the one thing that had made me feel truly alive. It was a choice. I could retreat back into the safety of my shadows, or I could step into the light, whatever the consequences. I didn't answer him with words. I couldn't. The words were all tangled up with years of unspoken longing. Instead, I closed the small distance between us. I moved slowly, deliberately, giving him every opportunity to pull away, to stop me. But he didn't move. He just watched me, his breath hitched in his chest. I lifted my hand and gently cupped his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble there. His skin was warm. He leaned into my touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement That was all the permission I needed. And then I kissed him. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not a kiss of pent-up demand. It was the quietest, most tentative kiss of my life. It was a question, an answer, and a confession all at once. It was just the soft pressure of my lips against his, a moment of stillness in the heart of the storm. It lasted for only a few seconds, but in those seconds, the entire landscape of my world rearranged itself. The fault line that had been trembling for months finally gave way, and everything shifted. When I pulled back, we just looked at each other. The air was still charged, but the anxious tension was gone, replaced by a kind of stunned, fragile wonder. He lifted his own hand, and his fingers brushed against my lips, as if to confirm that what had just happened was real. "Oh," he breathed, a single, soft syllable of comprehension. And in that one word, I heard the answer I had been too afraid to even hope for. It was the sound of a door swinging gently open, not onto a hallway of ambiguity, but into a room I had only ever dreamed of entering. The aftermath was not the gentle dawn I had imagined. I had thought the kiss was a destination, the end of a long and difficult journey. I quickly learned it was only the beginning of a new one, a passage into a landscape that was even more confusing and treacherous than the one we had left behind. When I woke the next morning, the space beside me in the bed was empty and cold. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow, but Leo was gone. Not just from my room, but from the apartment. His swim bag was missing from its usual spot by the door, his keys gone from the hook. A cold, heavy dread settled in my stomach. I told myself he had just left early for morning practice. It was plausible. It was logical. But I knew, with a sick certainty, that it was a lie. This was not a normal morning. This was a retreat. He didn't come back that day. My texts went unanswered, each one a small, hopeful boat I launched into a vast, silent ocean, only to watch it sink without a trace. "Hey, did you forget your protein shaker?" Casual. Non-threatening. No reply. "Everything okay? Haven't heard from you," a little more direct. Still nothing. By evening, the dread had curdled into a bitter mix of hurt and panic. Had I imagined it all? Had I taken a moment of his grief-stricken vulnerability and twisted it into something it wasn't? The memory of the kiss, which had felt so real, so mutual, began to feel like a violation, a trespass I had committed. I replayed the moment over and over, analyzing it from every angle, my mind a relentless prosecutor. His stillness, his soft exhale of, "Oh." Had I misinterpreted them completely? Had it been a sound of shock? Of horror? The quiet wonder I had seen in his eyes now seemed, in my memory, like fear. I had been so sure. And now I was sure of nothing, except that I had shattered the most important thing in my life. The friendship that had been my only shelter was now a ruin, and it was my fault. He was gone for 3 days. 3 days of agonizing silence, of an apartment that felt cavernously empty without his presence. I didn't sleep. I barely ate. I wandered the rooms like a ghost, the silence amplifying my self-recrimination. On the 3rd night, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than any possible rejection. I needed to hear it from him. I needed the final, brutal confirmation so I could begin the work of mourning the loss of him. I found him where I knew he would be, at the University Aquatic Center. It was late, long after the official team practice had ended. The vast space was mostly dark, except for the ethereal, chlorinated blue light illuminating the 50-meter pool. And there he was, just swimming, lap after lap, his powerful form cutting through the still water, the only sound the rhythmic splash and pull of his strokes. He was swimming not for time, not for training, but for oblivion. He was trying to outrun something, to exhaust the confusion from his body. I waited on the bleachers in the shadows until he finally stopped, hanging onto the side of the pool, his chest heaving, his head bowed. I walked down to the edge, my footsteps echoing in the huge, empty natatorium. He heard me, and his head snapped up. When he saw me, his face was a mask of exhaustion and conflict. He didn't look angry. He just looked lost. "Leo," I said, my voice hoarse. "You can't just disappear. You can't do that to me." He didn't say anything. He just pushed himself out of the pool in one fluid motion and sat on the edge, water streaming from him, his shoulders slumped. "Talk to me," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Please, just tell me what's happening. If I messed up, if I read everything wrong, just tell me. I can take it. It's the silence I can't handle." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a pain that mirrored my own. "You didn't mess up," he said, his voice low and rough. "I did." He ran a hand over his wet face, pushing his hair back. "I don't know what's happening, Alex. That's the problem. The last few months, being with you, it's the only time I've felt okay. The only time the noise in my head stops. I thought it was just because you were my friend. Because you were being kind to me." He shook his head, looking down at his hands. "But that night, when you kissed me, it wasn't. I wasn't scared of you." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I was scared because for the first time in a very long time, I felt something. Something real. And it wasn't something I was supposed to feel. I've spent my whole life on a track, Alex. You know? Swim practice, school, Chloe, the future. It was all laid out. A straight line. And you're not on that track. And it terrifies me. Because nothing has ever felt as right as sitting in the dark with you. And that makes no sense. So I ran. I ran because I don't know who I am if that's true." His confession hung in the humid, chlorine-scented air between us. It was not the rejection I had feared. It was something far more complicated. It was a confession of his own fear, his own profound confusion. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself, from a truth he wasn't ready to face. The hurt that had been a tight, cold knot in my chest began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. He was just as lost as I was. We were both cartographers in an uncharted land. I sat down on the wet tiles next to him. I didn't touch him. I just sat there, closing the distance, letting him know I wasn't going anywhere. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Leo," I said softly. "You don't have to name it or put it in a box. We don't have to be on any track. We have to not run away. We have to talk. Can we do that? Can we just start there?" He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. I held his gaze, letting him see everything I felt. The years of affection, the recent months of hope and fear, and the quiet, steady certainty I felt now. I didn't know where this path was leading, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I wanted to walk it with him. He gave a small, tired nod. "Okay," he whispered. "Yeah, let's start there." The conversation that followed was the most honest one of our lives. We didn't go back to the apartment. We just stayed there, by the side of the glowing blue pool, the water a silent, listening witness. We talked for hours, our voices low in the cavernous space. I told him everything. I told him about the first time I realized I had feelings for him, back in our freshman dorm room. I told him about the years of carefully guarding that secret, of convincing myself that his friendship was enough. I told him about the exquisite torture of the last few months, of lying next to him every night, wanting so much more, but being too terrified to risk what we had. I laid all my cards on the table, exposing the vulnerable truth of my heart. I was showing him the photograph I had kept hidden in the dark for so long. And he, in turn, told me about his own confusion. He talked about his relationship with Chloe, how he had loved her, but how, in retrospect, it had felt like he was playing a part he'd been assigned. The star athlete with the perfect girlfriend. He confessed that my quiet presence had always been a source of stability for him, a place where he didn't have to perform. He admitted that after the breakup, turning to me was instinctual. He wasn't just seeking comfort from a friend. He was seeking a specific kind of peace that only I seemed to provide. He talked about the growing awareness, the moments of physical contact that felt different, charged with a meaning he didn't understand and was afraid to examine. The kiss hadn't created a feeling in him. It had simply forced him to look at one that was already there, growing in the dark. He wasn't scared of being with a man. He was scared because the one person who made him feel truly seen, truly safe, was me, his best friend, and that rewrote every rule he thought he knew about himself, about love, about his own heart. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. It was quieter than that, more fragile. It was an agreement to be brave together, an agreement to stop pretending. When we finally left the pool, the first hints of dawn were painting the sky a soft, hopeful gray. We walked back to the apartment in a comfortable silence, the space between us no longer filled with anxious tension, but with a quiet, shared understanding. When we got to our door, he stopped and looked at me. "Can I?" he started, but he didn't need to finish. "Yes," I said. We went into my room, but this time was different. There was no pretense of seeking refuge from grief. There was no ambiguity. He undressed down to his boxers and got into the bed, and I did the same. He turned to face me, and in the dim morning light, I could see his face clearly. The fear was gone, replaced by a gentle uncertainty that was more hopeful than fearful. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, a firm, deliberate gesture. "Stay," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. "Always," I replied. And I pulled him closer, and he came willingly, burying his face in my chest. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tight. It was not the chaste, careful embrace of a friend offering comfort. It was the embrace of two people who had finally found their way home. For the first time, we slept not as two separate bodies sharing a space, but as two people holding on to each other, a single, breathing entity in the quiet room. And for the first time, before I fell asleep, I reached over and gently, definitively, pushed my bedroom door until I heard the soft click of the latch. We were both inside now. There was no need for an open door anymore. The days that followed were a process of quiet discovery, of learning a new language together. The grand, dramatic moments of confession and crisis gave way to a series of small, domestic intimacies that felt far more profound. It was in the way he started leaving his toothbrush in the holder next to mine. It was in the way he'd hand me a coffee mug in the morning, already knowing exactly how I took it. It was in the way he'd reach for my hand while we were watching television, a simple, absent-minded gesture of connection that spoke volumes more than any passionate declaration could. We were building a new life, not on the rubble of his old one, but on the solid foundation of the friendship we had so carefully nurtured for years. The love had always been there, I realized. We had just been calling it by a different name. There was an ease to it that I had never anticipated. All the years I had spent worrying, constructing elaborate scenarios of rejection and disaster, had been a waste of energy. Being with him felt like coming home to a place I didn't even know I had been searching for. The parts of us that had seemed so different, his sun and my shadow, were not opposites, but complements. He drew me out of my shell, his easy warmth making the world feel less intimidating. And I, in turn, gave him a space of quiet, a place where he could just be Leo, not the star swimmer, not the campus hero, just Leo. A place where he didn't have to perform. We found a balance, a beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. I remember one afternoon, a few weeks after our talk at the pool. I was in the darkroom, and he came to find me. He had never come in there before. He'd always respected it as my private space. But he slipped in, letting the heavy door close behind him, plunging us into the soft, red-tinged darkness. He didn't say anything. He just came and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood there together in the red glow, watching as I gently rocked a tray of developer, watching an image of his own smiling face slowly emerge from the blank white paper. It was a photo I had taken at one of his meets, a candid shot of him just after a race, looking over at the stands, searching for someone. Now, I knew he had been searching for me. "It's like magic," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "It's not magic," I said softly. "It's just chemistry. It's about bringing what's already there into the light." He was quiet for a moment, and then he tightened his grip around me. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I guess it is. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The world outside, with its expectations and its labels, seemed to fade away. In the quiet sanctuary of our apartment, we were just Alex and Leo. We were two people who had found in each other a safe harbor from the storm. The love story I had been so afraid to even imagine was not a dramatic novel full of conflict and climax. It was a series of quiet, candid photographs, moments of simple truth, developing slowly, perfectly, in a dark room made safe by trust, and finally brought into the beautiful, gentle light.